Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so have you ever actually stopped and wondered how a country's wealth, its massive government budgets, and the literal money in your pocket all connect? Well, today we're going to look at the economy as this giant, totally interconnected machine. And I promise you, by the time we're done here, the complex gears of macroeconomics won't just make sense, they are going to be crystal clear. But right before we get to the gears and levers of this whole machine, I want you to think about a super counterintuitive puzzle. If a country produces a million completely faulty products, right? Stuff that instantly breaks and constantly needs replacing, does that country officially get richer? Just keep that in the back of your mind, because it perfectly teases our later discussion on the surprisingly huge limits of how we actually measure success. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to explore 6 critical parts of our machine today. We'll start with measuring national wealth, then look at the limits of GDP, the government budget, fiscal and monetary policy, the money market, and finally, interest rates and inflation. Part 1. Measuring national wealth, the dashboard of the economy. So when we want to know how this economic machine is actually performing, we look at a metric called gross domestic product, or as you probably know it, GDP. You'll often see it calculated using what's called the expenditure approach, which looks exactly like this equation. But let's translate this math into a real-world story, right? The C stands for consumption, so that's literally you and me buying our weekly groceries. The I is for investment, like local businesses buying brand new equipment. The G is government spending on big things like schools, hospitals, and roads. And finally, we add net exports, that X minus M part, which is really just the money from the stuff we sell overseas minus the stuff we buy from them. But, there's actually another way to measure GDP called the production approach, and this one requires a little bit of care. Imagine Cabinet Island, right? It's an economy that literally only makes wood cabinets. Business A grows the trees and pays $2,000 in inputs. Business B mills that timber, adding $3,500 in wages, and then Business C makes the actual cabinets, adding another $5,000 in wages. Now, to find the true GDP, we don't just add every single sale together. If we did that, we'd be double counting the raw wood over and over again. Instead, we sum up the value added at each specific stage. That gives us a final totally accurate GDP of $10,500. And this brilliantly illustrates how these different viewpoints, like gross national expenditure or domestic factor income, all mathematically tie right back to that central dashboard metric of our national turnover. Whether we use the expenditure approach we saw first, the production approach from our little cabinet island, or an income approach that totals up all the wages and profits earned, we end up with the exact same national income figure. It's like a giant puzzle where all the pieces fit perfectly. Part 2. The limits of GDP. Why bigger isn't always better. All right, so we know how to measure the economy's size now, but we've got to ask a pretty absolutely crucial question. Do these big numbers actually represent human well-being? Well, it turns out GDP has some massive, massive blind spots. For one, it completely ignores unpaid household production, things like childcare and home maintenance. It totally underestimates long-term ecological costs like pollution. And hey, remember our opening question? Yeah, a country making faulty products will actually inflate its GDP when people are forced to buy replacements. It literally counts those negative bads as absolute economic positives. So while GDP is great at measuring pure output, a higher number absolutely does not guarantee better living standards or actual human happiness. Part 3. The government budget. Fueling the machine. So how exactly does the state plan out its fuel? A government budget is essentially a summary of expected revenue and planned expenditure for the upcoming financial year. And where does all that revenue come from? Well, governments rely incredibly heavily on taxation. It makes up a whopping 90% of their revenue. This includes direct taxes on your income, like PAE, and indirect taxes on your everyday spending, like VAT or custom duties. The remaining 10%, that just comes from other sources like interest, profits from government enterprises, and various miscellaneous receipts. Now, what's really interesting here is what happens when a government plans to spend more than it earns. That creates a budget deficit. Follow the pathway right down the middle here. To fund that deficit, the government has to borrow. It can borrow externally, which, gets impacted by exchange rates, or it can borrow internally. If it borrows internally straight from the Reserve Bank, it can lead to what's called a monetized deficit, which actually increases the overall money supply. But borrowing directly from the public or registered banks fully funds the deficit without magically injecting new money into the entire system. Part 4. Fiscal and monetary policy. Steering the machine. Think of it this way. If the budget is the fuel, these policies are the steering controls. Authorities essentially have 2 main directions they can steer us in. Over on the left, we've got expansionary policy.
If the economy is sluggish and slowing down, the government can lower taxes and increase spending while the central bank lowers interest rates. This encourages all of us to borrow, spend, and produce, which really boosts economic growth. But on the flip side, over on the right, if things are running way too hot and prices are just spiraling out of control, they pull the contractionary policy levers. They raise taxes, cut spending, and hike interest rates to pull money right out of the system and bring inflation back under control.
Part 5. The money market, the oil and gears. Let's move to the actual supply and demand for money, which really acts as the vital oil for our entire economic machine. Notice how this builds, because money isn't just the physical cash you have in your wallet. Economists actually measure the money supply in distinct levels of liquidity. M0 is just physical currency, the actual notes and coins. M1 adds check accounts, basically the most immediate accessible forms of money. Then M2 adds savings and near money, things that are easily converted to cash. And finally, M3, which is known as broad money, adds locked away term deposits. So it's really a full spectrum, from instantly spendable cash to safely stored away funds.
And why do people actually want to hold on to this money? Well, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes identified that we hold money for immediate transactions and as an asset for financial security. Just look at the downward slope of the demand curve based on interest rates. Now, follow those arrows. If the general price level goes up across the board or our real incomes increase, the entire demand curve shifts outward from MD0 to MD1 or 2. The logic is simple. We simply need more liquid money on hand to manage our daily economic lives whenever prices or incomes are higher.
Part 6. Interest rates and inflation, the cost of money. Simply put, the interest rate is the cost of borrowing money, or alternatively, the reward you get for saving it. But there is a massive trap here that catches a lot of people off guard. The nominal interest rate is just the current market rate you see advertised on the window at your local bank. However, the real interest rate is what actually matters to your purchasing power. To find your true, real return, you have to take that nominal rate and subtract the rate of inflation. So the absolutely crucial point is this. Let's say you lock your hard-earned money in a bank account offering a pretty great nominal rate of 7%. Sounds good, right? But let's imagine inflation in the broader economy is running totally rampant at 12%. 7 minus 12 leaves you with a real interest rate of -5%. No way, right? Even though your bank balance is technically growing on paper, your actual purchasing power is shrinking by 5% every single year. Inflation literally takes a devastating cut of your wealth. To really understand why those prices rise in the first place, economists look at the quantity theory of money, which is represented by this equation, MV equals PY. The most fascinating variable here for sure is the V, the velocity of circulation. This measures how many times a single dollar travels around the economy from households to firms and back again in a single year. If the money supply, the M, increases rapidly while the velocity and real output stay stable, the direct mathematical result is an increase in P, the general price level, and that is exactly what inflation is. It's the exact same math that led to the famous hyperinflation of 1920s Germany, where velocity and money supply ran so wildly out of control that people literally needed wheelbarrows full of cash just to buy a single loaf of bread. We've seen how GDP measures our output, how budgets and interest rates steer our spending, and how money circulates through the entire system. But I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If the velocity of our money increases and the economic machine just runs faster and faster, inflating our GDP, are we truly living better lives, or are we just spending quicker? Keep that in mind the very next time you hear the latest economic news. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the machine.